Enjoy 1% merchant commission when you accept Lanka Pay cards. Contact these banks today.
Iran is very keen on an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And from the first day when the conflict began, or at least one could say when the conflict entered a new phase, Iran has been calling for an immediate ceasefire. Unfortunately, Western allies of the Israeli regime were calling for the Israelis to attack Gaza. So I think the Iranian position is in line with the position of our peace-loving friends in Sri Lanka. But ultimately, in order for us to have real peace and permanent peace in West Asia, the concept of racial hierarchy or ethnic-supremacism, apartheid, this has to be set aside. And as long as the Israeli regime pursues ethnic cleansing, as long as it continues to kill Gazans, and the killing of Gazans didn't begin after October the 7th. We know that this has been going on for decades, and October 7th was basically a response from the Gazan people who were subjugated for decades. But as long as we have this situation, I think peace will elude us. The South African model for Iran is the ideal one, in the sense that the white supremacist regime ultimately collapsed, and now we have a multicultural society in South Africa. Of course, South Africa has many problems, like all other countries, but at least when it comes to racial supremacism, it is no longer a country which tolerates that sort of ideology. So the Israeli regime has to put aside the ideology of Zionism, where one set of people have exclusive rights to the land, and the people who actually lived there for centuries are ignored, and their rights are taken away from them and given to people from Europe who they consider to be superior. That cannot continue. Well, so far, there has been no successful attempts to carry out an airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities. But since the United States and the Israeli regime are aggressive, and since they ignore international law, the Iranians have put all of their key assets underground. So even if the Israeli regime wants to attack Iranian's nuclear infrastructure, or the Americans wanted to do such a thing, it would be virtually impossible for them to destroy the nuclear program, because the key elements of the nuclear program cannot be destroyed from the air. Iran's peaceful nuclear program is actually more developed than the Israeli regime's program. But unlike the Israeli regime, which has nuclear weapons, Iran has never pursued such capabilities. And as we speak, Iran does not desire to produce nuclear weapons. If Iran wanted nuclear weapons, it could have developed them many years ago. And it is very easy for Iran to do so, because Iran is one of the most advanced the fact that the Israeli regime has produced nuclear weapons, and it has threatened countries and people with those weapons, I think says a lot about the Israeli regime. Whereas on the other hand, the Iranians have never, not only have they never threatened anyone, but they've never actually pursued the option of having such weapons. So I think there's a big difference between the Israeli regime and Iran when it comes to nuclear energy and humane behavior. No, the Iranians believe that a nuclear capability would only encourage more countries to have nuclear weapons. And so Iran's policy is to steer clear of such weapons. One good example to show that Iran has always been sincere in this regard is the 1980s war which Saddam Hussein imposed on Iran with Western support. When Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran, Western countries gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, and he used them extensively with Western support. They also gave him military intelligence to use chemical weapons and also political cover to be able to use the weapons and not be condemned. In Iran, the state, the government, the leader, said that Iran will not pursue chemical weapons. Even though Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons against Iran, Iran refused to produce its own chemical weapons in response. So Iran's policy for nuclear weapons is the same. It does not want nuclear weapons because it sees it as a threat to the world. Well, the solution for Iran is that Israel must cease to exist as an apartheid regime, and that the only solution is a one-state solution. And Israel does not have the moral right to exist as a supremacist regime. The Israelis have to come to terms with reality, and that is that all human beings are equal and of equal value. And they cannot choose one race over another, or one ethnicity over another, and erase a population from the land and plant another population from Europe in their place. That is not going to happen. It won't be accepted, and the region won't allow it. For Iran, the only solution is one where Jews, Christians, Muslims live side by side as equal citizens. You have something like this in your own country. You have people with different ethnicities and different religions. But you do not have a hierarchical system where you say one race is superior, or one people from one ethnic background is superior. They can take the land of everyone else. They can take the homes of everyone else. They can expel other people. You live in relative harmony, and that is what we must not see in Palestine. And in any case, the Israeli regime has colonized so much of the West Bank that a two-state solution isn't feasible anyway.
It's not.
No. I think that normalization with Israel is a threat to their own security, because our public opinion is extremely hostile towards the Israeli regime's policy of ethnic cleansing and genocide and the general humiliation of the Palestinian Republic. So whether it's in the Arabian Peninsula or elsewhere, the public is fully against any normalization. So if a leader or a ruler in an Arab country moves towards some sort of deal with the Israelis or some sort of relationship, that person's or that regime's legitimacy in the eyes of its own population will decline. So it will hurt them first and foremost. Especially after the genocide in Gaza, the situation has changed dramatically. The Israelis are now seen as a pariah state or a pariah regime, to be more accurate, across the world. Even traditional friends of Israel are distancing themselves, and we see how today, even in the United States, young people, including many young heroic Jews, are standing up against the regime. So at a time when the regime's legitimacy is being questioned by an increasingly large number of people, I find it very unlikely that Arab leaders would move in the opposite direction. Fortunately, the Iranian economy grew at over 6% last year, and the year before it had relatively good growth. We'll have to see what happens in the year ahead. But the new sanctions really won't have any meaningful impact on the Iranian economy. And the reason is that the United States is already implementing what they call maximum pressure sanctions. So you can't become more maximum than maximum. They've literally sanctioned everything that there is to be sanctioned. There isn't much that they can really do anymore. They've lost their leverage, both the Europeans and the Americans, because they've sanctioned literally everything. So I can sanction you 5 times and then sanction you again a 6th time, but if you're already sanctioned, you're sanctioned. So it doesn't really make a difference. Also, the energy market today is a very tight market. There's no excess capacity. Oil is the price of oil is pretty high right now, and Russian oil is sanctioned, Venezuelan oil is sanctioned. The United States really cannot prevent Iran from exporting its oil today, and Iran's oil, as we speak, is being exported to different countries despite the sanctions, and Iran is producing at full capacity and selling everything that it has. So I highly doubt that the Americans will be able to have much of an impact on Iran. Well, I think the very fact that President Raisi is here today and that a major project has been inaugurated shows that the limits of American power are becoming increasingly evident. And President Raisi's trip to Pakistan was also successful, and the two sides agreed to push forward the gas pipeline. So again, I think it shows that gradually the influence of the United States is on the decline, and countries in the global south recognize that they cannot sacrifice themselves simply because the Americans want them to do so. The non-aligned movement, of course, is one thing. The concepts that lie behind the creation of the non-aligned movement is another thing. The concept itself, I think, is alive and well in the world that we live in today, and it is becoming increasingly important. And BRICS is one manifestation of that belief. BRICS is an organization which is on the rise, and it does bring countries from across the globe and the global south together to enhance their economic cooperation with one another, independent of Western financial institutions and independent from Western pressure. But it's not only BRICS. Other regional organizations are on the rise. One such organization which Iran joined a couple of years ago was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we do see movements across the Global South to create regional and global organizations in order to enhance the role of Global South countries and to make sure Western countries do not overstep their bounds in future as they have in the past. So I do think that we are moving towards a multipolar order. It will be complicated, it will be messy, it will probably be very dangerous in many parts of the world, but I think it's inevitable. The West is on the relative decline. It has been on the relative decline for quite a while, and I think that decline has quickened because of Gaza. Their soft power across the world has diminished because the world sees them supporting a genocide, but also because of their military and economic conflict with Russia, which has hurt the West more than it has hurt Russia. So these two recent events, I think, are acting as catalysts and speeding up the decline of the West even further. I'm not saying that the West is going to be a diminished entity which will have no influence, but I think it will have a relatively smaller amount of influence in global affairs in the future than it does now. I don't think it's as clear-cut as that, because during the Cold War there are two predominant ideologies. It was liberal capitalism on the one side and socialism and communism on the other. Even though back then it wasn't all that clear-cut either, because the Soviet Union and the Chinese had sharp differences that were increased, especially after Nixon traveled to China. But I think now it's not so much. I think it's even more diverse now. The amount of ideological diversity, cultural diversity that we see today is much greater than back then. Russia is not the Soviet Union. China is not the China of the 1970s and the 1980s. And I think in general, Global South countries, many of them have become much more important than before. Countries like Iran, Brazil, South Africa, they carry much more weight than they did back then. So I don't think it's going to be bipolar. I think it will be multipolar, but it will be more fluid than many people probably think. But I would also add that Iran's relationship, or increasingly important relationship with Russia and China, is partially due to the policies of the West itself. When the West antagonizes Russia and Iran, they create an incentive for them to come closer to each other. When the West antagonizes China, they incentivize China to move closer to Iran and Russia. And when the West sanctions Russia, then that creates a greater incentive for Russia to cooperate with India, and Iran becomes the transport corridor between Russia and India. So the West is inadvertently creating a whole new environment for trade and business and politics from which it is excluded, and it's largely because of their own policies of antagonism, and by antagonizing so many countries simultaneously. I was never a negotiator. I was a media advisor, so I am not involved in the negotiations themselves. But Iran is open to resolving the issue with the United States and the Europeans. The Iranians and the P4+1, they, a couple of years ago, they almost came to an agreement. And they were almost there. And in fact, the European foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell, at that time made a statement in public which was interpreted as accepting the Iranian position. But after that, the Americans pulled back, and we reached the midterm elections in the United States, and since then we haven't had progress, or at least we haven't had a solution. So it is possible